It was an ordinary day that turned into a nightmare in an instant. Nadia, a black woman with a proud gaze, was walking calmly down a busy street, lost in thought. She was on her way to an appointment, and everything seemed peaceful. The sunlight gently caressed her face, and the city's sounds surrounded her without reaching her. Suddenly, a police car screeched to a halt beside her. The doors slammed open, and two officers stepped out, their faces hard and determined. They had no idea who she was, her story, or who her husband was. To them, Nadia was just another figure in the crowd, an easy target in a world where prejudice guided their actions. Nadia felt a wave of tension rising. She knew this scene all too well. She had heard the stories of other black women, women like her, who had been silenced by the violence of a racist system. But she wasn't just anyone, and she had no intention of being intimidated. She straightened up, rooted in the ground like a tree refusing to bend under the storm. Fixing her gaze on the officers, she spoke in a firm yet calm voice. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else." Her voice resonated in the air, carried by an inner strength she hadn't even anticipated. The officers exchanged a brief, indifferent glance. Her words seemed to slide off them without leaving a mark. All they saw was a black woman they needed to control. Their decision had already been made. Without warning, one of the officers grabbed her arm with a brutality that startled the passers-by. Nadia, though prepared for this kind of violence, felt a mix of indignation and fear wash over her. Her hands were forced behind her back, the cold handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists. Around her, faces turned, some horrified, others indifferent. But no one stepped forward. She knew that at that moment, it wasn't just her being chained. It was every black woman before her, those who had suffered in silence, humiliated and silenced by centuries of injustice. Yet, despite the pain and shame engulfing her, Nadia refused to give in to fear. She wasn't just a victim of this brutality. She was the voice of all those women who had never had the chance to speak. Every agonizing step she was forced to take felt endless. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, and the weight of injustice crushed her soul more violently than the physical pain. As she was dragged roughly toward the police car, every jolt and every harsh step was a cruel reminder of what it meant to live in a society where her skin color made her an easy target. The officers, blinded by their hate and contempt, didn't see the woman she was. They didn't see her as a person, only as a threat to their authority, an obstacle to their dominance. One of them grabbed her arm roughly, while the other, in an act of unspeakable cruelty, yanked her hair as if her pain were a trophy to flaunt. Her scraped knees dragged against the asphalt, every pebble amplifying her suffering. Her worn shoes gave way under the violence of the officer's actions, bearing witness to the uphill path she had always had to walk. But the worst pain didn't come from the physical violence. It was the feeling of being dehumanized, treated as an intruder in a neighborhood where her mere presence was an unforgivable offense. These officers weren't just trying to restrain her. They wanted to destroy her, to break her into pieces, as though she had no right to exist, especially not here, in this wealthy area where she was, to some, an anomaly. As Nadia continued to resist inwardly, her body began to falter. The pain was overwhelming. Yet even pinned to the ground, she clung to an inner flame, the flame of her dignity. Every moment was a battle, not just against the physical violence but against despair, against the urge to surrender to defeat. She refused to let herself be silenced, even as her body screamed in pain. When they finally reached the patrol car, one of the officers yanked her upright with a rough motion. Her breathing was labored, and she staggered but remained standing, even as her legs trembled under the weight of the blows. Her face contorted with pain, she gazed at the horizon, determined not to yield, not to give in to the humiliation. "Get up," barked one of the officers, his tone dripping with icy contempt. He kicked her in the ribs to force her to rise more quickly. But it wasn't just an order to move. That tone, that violence, carried a much deeper meaning. It was a command to submit, to bow to a system that didn't want her. Yet, despite the blows, despite the pain, Nadia stood unyielding. She could feel the stares of some passers-by, some frozen in indifference, others in silent terror. None stepped forward to help. None dared challenge the authority crushing her under their gaze. But in her eyes, a flame still burned. They could hit her, humiliate her, but they couldn't extinguish that light, the one that shone for all the black women before her, for all those who had been forgotten, erased from history. They could drag her to the ground, but they would never silence her. As she was placed in the police car, her bruised and aching body, Nadia closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of her husband, her loved ones, of all the battles she had fought to get to this point. And in that crushing moment of solitude, she whispered to herself with unwavering determination, "You will not break me." The car doors slammed shut with a heavy thud, but that sound wasn't an end. It was the beginning of another battle, a battle for dignity, for justice. Nadia knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Her husband, her community, and all those who had suffered in silence before her carried this struggle with her. And despite everything, she would never give up. The patrol car was now on its way to the police station, each jolt amplifying the pain Nadia felt. The car's interior was like a mobile prison, with palpable tension in the air. The officers exchanged hushed remarks, assuming that Nadia, now slumped in a corner, was nothing more than a silent victim. But one of them, a young man with brown hair and icy blue eyes, cast a furtive glance at the scattered papers on the passenger seat, among which was Nadia's identification. As he scanned the documents, his eyes landed on a professional card clearly displaying the name of her husband, David Leroy, a renowned lawyer and civil rights activist whose name resonated throughout the country. Shock and worry immediately clouded the officer's face. He dropped the card with a sharp sound, his gaze hardening as he turned to his colleagues. "You're not going to believe this," he murmured, his voice trembling with unease. He showed them the card. The other officers, initially skeptical, scrutinized it and then exchanged increasingly incredulous looks. The reaction was immediate. One officer, who had been the most brutal, stopped abruptly, his expression turning confused. Addressing Nadia, his tone betrayed a mix of embarrassment and authority. "We're going to need to call a superior. It seems this matter is more complicated than we thought." Even through her pain, Nadia sensed a shift in the officer's behavior. Though still handcuffed, her proud and determined gaze never faltered. The officer's aggression was now tinged with nervousness and urgency, as they found themselves caught in a situation they hadn't anticipated. "You've made a serious mistake," Nadia stated, her voice firm and resolute despite her exhaustion and pain. "Now you know who you're dealing with. But even if you try to fix your error, it won't erase what you've done to me." David Leroy was in his office, surrounded by scattered files, when he received the call that would upend his day. The trembling voice of one of his colleagues informed him of Nadia's brutal arrest. In those first moments, disbelief took over. Known for his usual composure, David stood abruptly, his eyes widening as he tried to comprehend the gravity of what had happened. "What? Nadia? How could this happen?" His voice, typically measured, was now filled with despair and anger. In an instant, his shock turned into cold, calculated rage. He knew the situation demanded a swift and decisive response. David immediately rushed home, where he found Nadia in shock, her face bruised and battered from the police violence. Seeing his wife in such a state awakened a relentless determination within him. He knew he had to use every resource at his disposal to confront this injustice. Once Nadia was stabilized at the hospital, David organized an emergency press conference. In a packed room of reporters, he stood before the cameras and microphones, his face marked by a simmering yet controlled fury. His words were powerful and piercing. "Today, my wife, Nadia Leroy, was subjected to intolerable police brutality. She was arrested without just cause, and the violence inflicted on her is a disgrace to our society. This is not merely an administrative error. What we're witnessing is systemic racism that cannot be ignored. I demand not only an apology from the authorities, but also a thorough investigation and reform of police practices." His words resonated like a call to action, capturing the media's and the public's attention. David's statements dominated headlines and news reports, creating a ripple effect across the country. His plea for justice struck a chord in every household, sparking a wave of popular support. David also mobilized his influential contacts in the legal and civil rights communities. He reached out to prominent lawyers with expertise in police brutality cases to assemble a strong defense team for Nadia. He enlisted human rights organizations and community leaders to amplify the pressure on the authorities. The response was swift and effective. Protests erupted in multiple cities, drawing media attention and increasing pressure on officials to act. David's legal team began investigating the circumstances of the arrest, gathering witness testimonies and evidence to build a robust case. David knew the fight was far from over, but he was determined to see justice served. Every step he took was a move toward uncovering the truth and seeking reparation for Nadia. His unwavering commitment and ability to rally massive support transformed the situation, making the fight for justice both inevitable and unstoppable. After weeks of damning testimony, the officers responsible for Nadia's arrest were confronted with undeniable evidence: video footage of the incident, witness statements, and medical reports. The officers' defense attempted to justify their actions as procedural errors, but this failed to divert attention from the underlying racism in their behavior. In the courtroom, Nadia spoke with regained dignity. "This is not just my story. Today, I speak for all Black women who endure this violence, who are humiliated, silenced. We are not invisible. We deserve justice." David, steadfast by her side, supported her statement by advocating for necessary reforms in the judicial and law enforcement systems. The final verdict came. The officers were found guilty of multiple charges, including excessive use of force and abuse of power. This victory, though symbolic, represented a significant step toward acknowledging systemic injustices. The conviction paved the way for reforms, including mandatory anti-discrimination training for law enforcement and new measures for transparency. Nadia and David became prominent public figures in the civil rights movement, turning a personal tragedy into a collective fight for justice. This story reminds us that every fight for justice is a step toward a fairer world. By honoring the courage of Nadia and David, we also celebrate the resilience of all those who continue to fight to ensure every voice is heard and every injustice is addressed.